I mean, it's dissonant because you look at games, and certainly, even today, I mean, I think even 10 years ago, I mean, they're technically very impressive, and so I think it's surprising. I think it's surprising from inside the games world to realize how they may be coming across to people who don't care about games, that they still don't care. And so I often wonder, is it just a byproduct? Like, are games still not, quote unquote, good enough to merit this type of attention? Or is it partially a factor of there aren't enough olive branches to people who didn't grow up playing games, or reaching out to people who choose not to play games? I don't know. I don't know that has an answer, because it seems to me like it would be easier for games to be part of these bigger conversations if they made people care somehow. But I don't know how much of that is actually games' fault.
Well, to some degree, I felt like games were maturing technically and formally faster than they were maturing in terms of their content or meaning, right?
Right.
So, as we think about what makes something an art form that the general public engages with and knows it has to engage with, whether it cares about that medium or not, the content axis is always as important or more important than the formal axis. So there's no question that games are good enough formally. They are pushing the technology, right? That's always the way game industry defends itself against these charges, right? But this is where the game violence stigma sticks, is the sense, well, there's still shooting galleries that have grown into something that's aesthetically beautiful. But is there a depth of meaning behind them that people who are not gamers recognize?
And I don't know if those are questions that they're willing to examine if, as you already cited, they are as lucrative, at least as they brag that they are. That there's, because you can look at that either as that's tremendous bragging rights, but it's also you have that much to potentially lose.
Yeah, I mean, so people used to call cinema the toy that grew up, because it started with motion toys and arcade machines and became an art form fairly rapidly. Yeah. You could say that games are a toy that's never grown up, right? That it's remained a toy because play mechanics dominate the aesthetic concerns of the best designers and the industry itself. So I remember at one of our EA workshops, Bing Gordon said, you have to understand genre has no meaning in our industry. And I thought, that's really interesting. And I realized that we meant that we were talking about somewhat different things when we talked about genre. It's not that games don't have genres, right? We can sort of say racing games versus shooting games, but those genres are defined around play mechanics, but not content. And Bing's point was that for a Western setting or a science fiction setting, are just things that are layered on top of the play mechanics for them. And they're equivalent of making a chessboard with Star Trek characters versus knights and castles, right? Chess doesn't change. It's still chess, no matter what kind of thing you make the characters look like on the chessboard, you're playing the same game. And there is a layer of meaning to chess that matters, but it doesn't change when you change the skin. And games seem on that level to have stayed on that level. Whereas I think the general public, it matters that we're looking at a game where people are just blowing each other's heads off. They don't see a play mechanic there, they see a content. And that matters whether they can tell a story or create an experience that asks questions about violence as opposed to just reproducing violence. That's how we can justify a Scorsese or a Tarantino as not just being violent entertainment in an abstract, but as meaningful art that speaks to our culture's relationship to violence. So that's what I keep looking for from games and just not seeing. And at a certain point, it was after Rockstar released Bully, and we had the hot coffee scandal and some other things.
Right.
I just got lost faith that the game industry had any real investment in pushing to that next level. That it was going to grow aesthetically, but it was not going to grow in terms of its meanings and investments. And I think
Based on
that's
the
what it has to do to become something that critics at large, or the public at large, that isn't playing games will engage with as a meaningful contribution to the culture.
based on the questions I've been asking you, does it sound like much has changed?
No, it sounds like you're asking about the same things we were thinking about a decade ago, and that's discouraging. Because
Yeah.
the game industry liked to believe that it was rapidly advancing compared to other media, that it was growing up faster. And I think, we used to say, well, let's use film as a stalking point. We're now at the point of, D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. Now we're at the point of Battleship Potemkin. We're now in the era of Citizen Kane, if we look at the actual age of games.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Cinema, by the time it was 40 years old as an industry, was producing major work that we still care about today, by all these axes of content and meaning that I'm talking about. And yes, Citizen Kane was an incredible technological and formal accomplishment, but it also asked deep questions about power and wealth in America. And I don't know what contemporary game is doing the latter.
Well, I know that you've said, well, you may not know, but I know that you've said in the past that you feel like you were an apologist for games. Do you, I'm sure you may see commercials for games, but based on what you see of things that are new or things that, your students have told you about, where does it seem like games are today? I know you said I'm asking some of the same questions you were wondering about 10 years ago, but content-wise, does anything surprise you or sound different? Yeah.
The biggest shift, and I've seen this, is not something one sees in commercials. It's the growth of the indie game movement. And that's where both formal experimentation and experimentation with meaning exist. So that my USC colleague, Tracy Fullerton, developed Walden as a game, based on Thoreau's book.
Right.
To suggest something rather different. It's sort of a fulfillment of Eisenstein's ambition that he could create Das Kapital as a montage film, right? That you can translate these works of deep philosophical impact into something that takes full advantage of their medium. The sad thing is the indie games like indie films have very limited resource and even more limited distribution. Right? The public isn't in these games. They're demonstrating that games could be different than they mostly are in the commercial mainstream, but they're not having the impact for the most part on the market. Every so often something like Portal breaks through or some, there are games that have done it, but it's not as if the indie film movement is shaping mainstream game releases at this point. And otherwise, the cases made for games that are outstanding and viewed by the industry as outstanding are still mostly technical cases. What can we get games to do, which have to do with programming chunks, or what the games look like, which have to do with visualization tools, but not to what games get us to think about.
Well, I think there's an irony here because I think outside of the content of games, there is an element of this, and you had touched on it as far as ways that Gamergate sort of foreshadowed Me Too. Are there other ways you feel games have foreshadowed things that have happened in culture, but maybe you haven't seen others articulate it, or that games are even aware that they foreshadowed things?
Huh. Yeah, but it's hard to nail them down with that kind of precise connection of causality. Certainly, people have noted the ways certain aspects of visual aesthetics move from games to film, or certain kinds of intensified action moves from games to film. Surprisingly, literal translation of games to cinema have generally failed, but films that evoke game aesthetics, The Matrix and Run Lola Run used to be the classic examples there, have been much more successful doing things within cinema that we might have not imagined if games didn't exist. Right? And I think there's been a persistence of that. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but now once we get to the point where half of the Marvel Extended Cinematic Universe movies are digital effects, and even the characters are digitalized. They are like game characters who are indestructible and can move, who's constantly moving across space, and the emphasis is on their capacities for action as much as their internal emotional states or motivations, all of which has a lot to say about what games influence the culture. But I think in a broader sense that we probably would not have those movies if people didn't grow up with games, and we certainly wouldn't have the 30-minute final battle sequences of those movies. Right? You know, where it is just, let's all out duke it out, you know, compared to playing a 2-hour final boss battle in a video game, that 30 minutes seems accelerated and abbreviated.
Right. Well, something I had been thinking about along those lines too are whether there are ways. I mean, you look at a game, a digitally connected game that lets you play with other people or be exposed to other people's behavior, sort of being similar to, or maybe even possibly a forerunner to, sort of the modern digital social network. And so I think people had always been saying that gamers are toxic and that they exhibit a lot of bad behavior, are very abusive to other people online, strangers. And yet this is a thing that has become synonymous with platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And so, I mean, I wondered if, games were allowed to have been bigger parts of national conversations, would we have had a more respectful internet today? Would dots be connected that well, I guess you know what I'm asking, and it is a hypothetical.
No, it's an interesting one. It's hard to know for sure, but I think there's definitely a possibility that Jocelyn gave me that article you wanted me to look at about the.
Oh, sure.
And I think it describes a particular cycle that social media has gone through, and suggests there are many different factors that contributed to that cycle. But I don't think it's inevitable, either then or now. I don't think it was inevitable, and I don't think it's irreversible. And I think choice points along the way, how culture shapes the user base, plays a role in our ability to imagine other possibilities for that medium plays a role. I think what shook me in that article was how deterministic a lot of the language was. That these digital, spokespeople were using the same languages of addiction, manipulation, mind control, and so forth that critics of theirs would have used in another moment of time. But in the same way that, say, a William Faulkner working for cinema held his medium in contempt for the same way that other intellectuals held it in contempt, right? So that language troubled me in that description. It's not that. Do you
have examples of the language that, like a certain phrase or something that struck you?
Look for that language of mind, literally. I mean, phrases like mind control, like addiction, manipulation. That language runs through it. Surveillance is literally true, right, in the sense that we are being watched and data is being collected on us. But the idea that the media control us rather than we control the choices we make in our relationship to media, that's the bias I'm talking about that runs through that piece that I found troubling. There's no question that the choices companies make about what new scenarios to support, what affordances to build in, what business models to make the decisions around, what algorithms promote content through, those are all things that do have an impact on how people use that media. But I think I think that's different from saying those determine how people think and feel, or that they shape the cultural norms that emerge on those platforms. Not just the internet companies have a lot to answer for. We have a lot to answer for from the choices we made, and the internet companies algorithms don't fully exclude some of the uses that are also growing that I think are very important. So someone like, oh God, Jared, I've totally lost his name, the virtual reality, Jared Lanier talks about every time we get a Me Too or a Black Lives Matter that we see the emergence of the KKK and white supremacist movements, right? And there's truth to that. My colleague Sarah Benet Weiser has a book on popular feminism and popular misogyny that's about to come out, where she argues that this use of both the platforms support and enable both, and that's why there's an endless battle around gender and digital culture, is that both have been empowered by the internet. But it's not that the internet produces white supremacy and therefore destroys the capacity of Black Lives Matter. That what Black Lives Matter has done in calling attention to racialized police violence hasn't gone away. It's had an enormous impact on the belief structure of mainstream American society, and has shifted the conversation about race in irreparable ways. I don't think we can say white supremacy has done the same. The internet has made white supremacy visible. It's enabled the regrouping of white supremacists for a final battle against some of the demographic changes that are taking place in America. But no matter how I look at it, Black Lives Matter comes out on top of that. And I think Me Too comes out on top of the misogynistic backlash on it. I think it's having very material effects. The Dreamers and their use of new media changed a conversation. The Parkland kids are changing the conversation in ways that the counter forces have not done and anywhere near as effectively. So I don't think that's a product of the internet. It's a product of cultural and political trends that would exist outside the internet that people have drawn themselves toward. So coming back then to the question about gamers, I would say that gamers, as long as gamers were adolescent males, that a culture of verbal abuse, which has always been part of how boys become men in American culture, was almost inevitable. That as long as we had social media platforms where people weren't accountable for their comments necessarily, or where as long as we were giving people access to the tools of cultural expression and circulation who never had access to them before, we were likely to see those tools be used irresponsibly. But I had always imagined that we would see norms emerge that went pushed back on that and that pushed toward greater civility and greater social maturity, because that's what the society needed and that's what the society wanted. And I think what I underestimated was the ability of business models of companies to sustain that in the face of social outrage over some of that behavior. And that's not about technology determining our behavior. That's about corporations being non-responsive to the discussions that are taking place in their consumer base.
And so Gamergate would be an example of that, right?
Exactly. Gamergate is the gamers growing up and continuing to occupy spaces and have access to tools which they could use to harass individuals in a public way that those people wouldn't have had access to otherwise. So they're embracing tools that empower them to say whatever they want, and yet they have a poverty of imagination in thinking through how those tools could be used differently. And as long as major media companies made money off of that culture of harassment, that culture would persist. But it's not as if there hasn't been massive pushback on Gamergate from other groups who were pushing for other norms of expression and not the normalization of harassment culture.
Do you think that's strictly I mean, I've talked to people who worked in the Japanese game industry, and they have sort of given me the impression that Gamergate was very much specifically a Western phenomenon, and of course on top of that, it's a digital Western phenomenon. It was interesting, going back and rereading some of your earlier books, the letter writing campaigns that you mentioned with Star Trek. I mean, does it just feel like, are we just quicker to immediately go to rage over these types of I don't even know what you would call the nature of it. I mean, I think it comes down to just a desire for representation, right? But I don't recall there being a letter writing campaign around video games in the way that there was in Star Trek, and so
Well,
I'm
they
just
wouldn't
curious
use
why that
letters,
is.
but I would say that the use of social media to support Timeless, the show that got canceled and brought back because of popular demand 4 days later, that looks like an
Right.
accelerated version of the Star Trek letter writing campaign. Right? It's a different
Mm-hmm.
medium, but it's the same use. And if anything, those
Yeah.
letter writing campaigns are even more effective today than they were before. So I think what my question is whether Gamergate is really representative of the culture at large. My colleague Billy Proctor has been looking at fan response to Star Wars, and
Mm-hmm.
it feels like this toxic masculinity storyline inflates certain fairly small practices in small groups of people in the fandom and makes them symptomatic of a national trend when they may well not be. Right? That it will find the most outrageous content on a subreddit and make it public, and in the process they amplify those voices in the process of reporting them and may disproportionately pull them out of a context where there are lots of other people having responsible, civic-minded discussions around the same subject matter, which isn't charged by misogyny and racism. So I don't mean that we shouldn't have covered Gamergate because there were real lives at stake and real harassment taking place, and it really was symptomatic of a mob violence. But we may overcover some of these things now in the wake of Gamergate, which leads us to believe our culture is more hostile and aggressive than it really is. In the same way that a decade or two ago, work on researchers found that most people thought the crime rate in their neighborhood was much higher than it really was because they took every representation of crime on television as standing in for a larger group, when television news tended to report almost every crime in those communities. So we amplified the news coverage and saw it as representative of something bigger than it was.
So what are, I don't even know if there is a best, but what are maybe the smartest ways, for a subculture to learn from a thing like a Gamergate and how to sort of to telegraph, and communicate that lessons have been learned? Because I've interviewed many people who work at AAA game companies and have worked on Call of Duty who told me about just what it was like day to day during Gamergate. And I think that there was certainly a sense of what you were saying of either not feeling it was as dire as it seemed to be elsewhere, or I think a literal quote from when I interviewed was, "Oh, I don't care." So I don't know that those are necessarily, that the best reaction to it, but this is sort of something I'm wondering 4 or 5 years later, like, is Gamergate over? Is it just sort of ossified into the culture? Like, can you point to lessons from it, or do these things not really work that way?
Well, I think we are seeing, we do see persistence of misogyny in various fan nooks and crannies. I've been corresponding with a reporter on comics right now, and comics is undergoing its own kind of Gamergate moment around trolls are attacking mainstream publishers and artists and stores, and there's a lot of, bad stuff happening in the comics world. Or we could talk about Sad Puppies and the science fiction.
I was going to mention Sad Puppies, yeah.
as sort of outgrowths or mirror effects of Gamergate. But I'd also look at something called Race Fail, which took place in science fiction fandom 8-9 years ago, which was a heated online discussion on race in science fiction that got talked through to the bitter end, didn't result in necessarily the kinds of harassment and physical threats and rape threats and the other stuff that surrounds Gamergate, and resulted in the creation of publishing houses that deal with stories by science fiction writers of color that seems to have shifted how people vote on the Hugo Awards. In some ways, Sad Puppies was a response to the opening up to minority artists that Race Fail had helped to create. And Race Fail won that battle, or the group that emerged from Race Fail have won that battle. If you look at the nominees now and you look at the winners coming out of Hugo Awards, Sad Puppies is no more, right? So that's a story that looks rather different than the devastation that Gamergate left in its path. And we have to decide why were science fiction fans able to talk this through, science fiction writers able to talk this through and create new structures to support minority expression, and gamers unable to have a discussion which fully embraced female participation in the gaming world. And I don't know the answer to that. Again, I haven't studied
I think
that systematically.
Yeah.
It's the question I would be asking and exploring, and I think Race Fail would be the counterexample I might look at.
I think it might have something to do with just what we had mentioned before, with how much is on the line, and just sort of either a mistrust or a fear that the games industry has of its own audience. Certainly Gamergate is an example of that, but you say the wrong thing. I think they have had just decades of experience of that, of don't deliver on a promise of what's going to be in a product, and you're going to hear about it, and you're going to get a lot of pushback, and you're going to get a lot of vitriol. I think it's just the difference was Gamergate was, the audience putting itself on trial, and then it's spreading elsewhere. Yeah. So I feel like I feel like I'm in a good position with doing this last few years with these interviews, but I feel like the games industry feels like it's in a no-win position, and it's similarly grateful, though paranoid, about the rise of streamers and its players becoming even better advocates for its products. That it's almost sort of best served being an invisible sort of silent partner, even though they are the center, ostensibly.
Yeah.
So it's weird.
It's weird. The games industry in some ways is far more advanced in, say, policies toward IP and the willingness to allow modding and some of those practices. It thinks ahead of the rest of the industry in its interface with its fan base. And in some ways, it's more retrograde. And the Gamergate brings out that retrograde side of it, I think.
Well, I just got a few more here for you. I appreciate you making the time
Sure.
again. Are there ways that you've been surprised that games haven't crossed over in a mainstream sense, or maybe ways that they had and then disconnected and reseeded?
This is where, in some ways I'm oddly situated with this question, because now I mostly see games when they do cross over into the mainstream and have no idea what's not crossing. But I'm shocked by how rarely I see them in my news feed, or how rarely they crop up on the podcast and critical blogs I engage with. It's just, they're all, my students bring them to my attention, but because they're gamers. But you can occupy a space in the cultural mainstream in the United States and not think about games for months on end, right? And it's just, that's how invisible they are to most Americans. And yes,
I don't think the games, sorry.
Most Continue. Americans of a certain age, right? I'm my 60th birthday is coming up, so I am not the gamer generation. But that sense of, for people in their 50s and 60s, games aren't on the radar at all, most of the time. And they could be given the economic value involved and given the idea of cultural growth that we had a decade or so back, right? We hope that they would be more central to the culture than they have become.
Well, according to games, they are. That's sort of, one of the bigger things. As I mentioned before, that's the thing I'm continuing to probe is
and again, it depends on what we mean by games. My wife plays games on her phone all day long, right?
Yeah.
I don't anymore. I don't play phone games at all. But mobile games, casual games for women is where the highest growth area has been. And that's probably the games I see the most, although I don't pay that much attention anymore to what game she's playing on her phone, right? It's a background to many of our interactions. But that's the place the games start to penetrate into culture of people my age.
So you said that you tend to notice the ways that they do cross over from a content perspective. What do you seem to notice? Like, what seems to be really important for video games to have or to broadcast that's what they have?
Well, games cross over when they're already tied to mainstream storylines. So Star Wars
Yeah.
games are more likely to be visible, right? That's a given. Games cross over when they get made into films or television, rarely television shows, and usually then disappear again because those vehicles don't really succeed on their own
Yeah.
terms and their other media. Games cross over when something like Pokemon Go comes out that is so radically new that people are talking about it and playing it. And that's a game that my brother and sister-in-law play that game. He's only 4 years younger than me, so it's a good example of where games cross over into people, more older people in their lives at this point. Games cross over when they become the center of major controversies. Although, as we've said, the game's violence has largely receded, and
Yeah.
I haven't seen particular titles hit hot buttons quite the way that the Rockstar games did a decade ago.
Yeah. Does it seem like games are evolving towards anything, or does it feel like they are? I mean, I don't want to present a binary. If either they're evolving or stagnating, maybe they're doing a third thing or all three.
Yeah, that's what I can't tell because I'm literally not paying that much attention anymore. I don't know.
Yeah.
The evolution could take place and I'd be completely blindsided by it. But I'm not seeing any signs of, moving from Cro-Magnon to, Neanderthal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? That's the level of evolution I'm seeing at this point as far as I'm concerned.
Well, so given that, I mean, what are sort of the typical ways you hear people sort of either overstate the importance or influence of games?
Well, I think I think we don't overstate it when we're saying that it's a key socializing tool for young people today. It is central to the culture of my students in a way that it's peripheral to my generation's culture. And so if you're writing as a 30-something, you live in a world completely where games are as important as any other media, and you may spend as much or more time playing games as you do with any other media. But if you live in a world where you're in your 50s and 60s, that's simply not the case. So, if you're a publisher of a magazine like EW, who's likely in your 50s or 60s, you're not paying attention to that medium at all because it doesn't matter in your world and in your life. So the confusion comes when we try to look at those cultures together as one thing, as opposed to recognizing the generational differences in the cultures we're talking about. I'm not saying that the culture of people in their 50s and 60s is more important than the culture of people in their 20s and 30s. I don't think that at all. I think the power and wealth still resides in people in their 50s and 60s. So in that sense, they have the ability to define what sticks and what matters in the culture in a different way than people in their 20s and 30s have. They have the ability to declare avocado toast silly as opposed to a central dish, right? They have the power to define the millennial generation by eating avocado toast, which is a trivialization of all of the other cultural changes that are going on in their lives, right? So that power to define what matters still rests in the older generation. So I don't know that the power and importance of games is exaggerated so much as both groups confuse their experiences for the culture as a whole.
What significance or importance do you think video games have that other group you mentioned, the people outside of games? What's an importance you think that games doesn't understand it has taken on for people outside of it, the people it's trying to reach?
Well, I think its role as a social bridging tool is really important. In the same way that, say, the people in their 50s and 60s might think of golf as something you did, or softball league is something you did that
Mm-hmm.
brought a group together. Today, those functions are played more often by games. And I think people get together to play games in the way that they might have once gotten together to watch a television show or to listen to an album that just dropped or to go to a movie together, right? That's a particular importance of games that doesn't rest on the maturity of the medium so much as the social centrality of the medium. And as that becomes a habit, a lifestyle for people, that's where some of the generational divide falls. So I think that's a crucial part of what's not understood. There's a tendency still, I think, for people in their 50s and 60s to see games as socially isolated, right? And the experience of someone in their 20s and 30s is quite the opposite. It's cultural capital, it's social bridging tool, it's shared activities, it's a shared experience. They'll talk about having grown up playing a particular video game the same way my generation will talk about having grown up watching a particular TV show. And all of that social stuff is the center of why games matter in contemporary culture. Leave aside how much money is made and the size of the industry and all of that. I get all of those arguments, but to me the most compelling one is not aesthetic and it's not economic, it's social.
Well, there's another interesting social isolation with games that I hadn't realized until you mentioned it last fall in your office, which is about how games are lacking in iconography in political change. And I'm just curious, I mean, how did you start noticing that? What do you think it means, other than the joke about how apolitical gamers stereotypically are or were? Why does it not seem to have broken through in that arena?
I don't know the answer to that yet. I mean, since we talked, we've done more and more of these workshops around the country.
Yeah.
Getting people to think about the future, and we don't intentionally insert pop culture into those workshops, but we listen for it. And
it's interesting.
Certainly see references to Star Trek among the older generations, or Harry Potter and Hunger Games among younger generations, right? That certain stories just emerge. We're certainly seeing Black Panther become a shared reference point across all generations, right? Almost overnight.
Sure.
Right? That impact has been huge when we think about political change. I don't think I've ever seen a reference to a video game in any of the workshops I've done, right? And that's really interesting to me, but I don't. And it may be because many of our things are skewing older, or in some cases we're working cross-generationally, and young people know that those game references won't be understood by the older people. But even when we have a mostly young group, we don't see video games referenced in the way that these other pop culture texts are.
It's interesting because it's hard to notice things you hadn't noticed, but since you mentioned it to me, I had been keeping an eye out, and it's been maybe, I don't know, I think it was September or something when we met up, so it's been however many months since then, and I haven't seen a single instance of it since then. So I think I don't know the answer to it either, but I can confirm it.
So at a point that forms of pop culture are becoming central to our political discourse, video games are not, and that's interesting. I don't have an explanation yet, but it's interesting.
That's okay. No, well, I can at least confirm it still. So that's an interesting lead into what will be my last question for you, which is intentionally broad, and I ask everyone I speak to this. What do you feel video games have accomplished?
Well, I think they've contributed to a push toward a more participatory. And easy that games encourage a sort of worship for a particular period of time of interactivity. But I've always been less interested in interactivity that's hardwired into the technology than I am to the participation that grows up around the technology. And in that sense, I'm more interested at moments in time with the development of the league structure, the guild structure in World of Warcraft, the kinds of byproducts that fans created around the Sims, down to something like Minecraft today. That sense of we can take the building blocks our culture gives them and redesign them, remix them, remake them, and build something new together. And it's not that we wouldn't have had that without games. You know, certainly fan culture gets you there. Certainly other aspects of the internet, Etsy gets you there. Lots of other things get you in that direction. Remix and hip hop and techno and so forth. But I think games have been maybe the most important force toward a more participatory culture for the largest number of people. That I think more people have learned to think about technology as something they participate in, that they engage in larger communities through, that they can remake and redesign to do different things than any other project that's come out. And that's probably not what most gamers would point to as their big success, but I think it is maybe their biggest success.